Hello and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a changemaker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. The Supreme Court has been on an ideological tear in recent weeks, including gutting the right of a woman to choose what happens to her body, limiting states' long-standing ability to regulate carrying firearms in public, and severely limiting the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. All of this was done under the imprimatur of states' rights, except that the decisions freely contradict states' ability to decide for themselves when the court's conservative majority doesn't share the same moral preferences. A New Yorker is now free to carry a gun, but if that New Yorker is a woman, they do not have the right to choose an abortion. And in a 6-3 decision in West Virginia versus EPA, the court decided the agency cannot create comprehensive policies to reduce global warming. We're joined today by Kenneth Foard McCallion, an attorney and author of several books on environmental and public policy issues. He argues that the Supreme Court has dealt a body blow to this country's climate change policies. The irony is that the court claims it is returning power to the states and people when 68% of Americans surveyed by the Pew Research Center in 2019 said they believe government should be acting to, quote, reduce the effects of global climate change, unquote. Even 39% of Republicans who responded to that survey agree that government is not doing enough. Congress has relied on experts and agencies like the EPA to formulate policies in response to rapidly changing scientific insight into the environment because legislation simply takes too long to develop. Now, the court has undercut that authority, which will force Congress to debate new laws. And we know how slow and unresponsive Congress has become in the era of Mitch McConnell. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. You can learn more about Kenneth at www.McCallionLaw.com. McCallion Law is McCallionLaw.com. McCallion Law, no space, no dashes. Welcome to the show, Kenneth. How are you today?
Well, just fine, Mitch. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some issues with you.
Well, this is certainly an important issue, and I'm glad that you're here to have the conversation. Can we start off just with a simple summary of what was at issue in West Virginia versus the EPA? And if you could you explain on whose behalf West Virginia was suing?
Well, West Virginia was suing on behalf of the state and presumably the people of West Virginia. But more specifically, it was well known in the environmental community and legal community that basically the West Virginia government was representing really the special interests of the coal mining industry and fossil fuel powered utility plants. Mm-hmm. The basic issue in the case was whether the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, had the authority under the Clean Air Act to promulgate a broad-based policy regulations which would apply uniformly to the power industry and specifically the coal-powered plants. This in the environmental community and legal community made a lot of sense, and the EPA has done this for a number of years where there's a major issue environmental issue involved, whether it be clean air, clean water, or other environmental issues, that the polluters be treated even-handedly across the board with a comprehensive regulatory scheme rather than on a plant-by-plant or a case-by-case or pollution point-by-pollution point basis. What the West Virginia case did was to turn this very sensible policy approach, broad-based policy approach by the EPA on its head, saying, no, you can't regulate across the board. You have to, can only do it on a case-by-case basis. And while there may be, in fact, such thing as climate change that requires that requires vigorous and comprehensive action. That is really the bailiwick of Congress. So you have to go back to Congress. This really doesn't make any sense because in the constitutional scheme that we have, Congress enacts legislation. It can be general or specific, and it can delegate to experts such as the Environmental Protection Agency the details of how to carry out those objectives. The Clean Air Act set forth clear objectives to really remedy the mounting and serious air pollution in this country, leaving it to the EPA to implement the necessary regulations. And this approach worked just fine for decades until most recently the Supreme Court now and other courts and conservative think tanks, Heritage Foundation and others, came up with a new legal theory, the major case issue, saying that any major policy decision cannot be made by the EPA, but must go back to Congress.
Well, that's a key point. This notion of the major questions doctrine. You just called out the fact that the Heritage Foundation was one of the sources of this. This appears to be a completely new concept that has no real basis in lower court decisions. Is that the case? And how does the court just do that then?
Well, it is really a relatively new vintage. It really was not in legal periodicals or articles or in discussion in the community, really, to my knowledge, until about a year or two ago. It did percolate up and appear occasionally in district court opinions, but it never appeared in a Supreme Court decision until there was a concurring opinion recently relating to COVID-related regulations by the government. And now it's embedded in the majority decision in West Virginia versus CPA. So it basically, if you step back at it, you don't have to be a lawyer to understand that a Supreme Court says, a regulation is a major question, which requires, there's really no objective test for that. It's a subjective test.
Right.
They can invalidate any regulation that displeases them.
Well, and that subjectivity is what makes this decision even more confusing, because as you point out, at least before there was a level playing field, an energy company would have a strong understanding of what they needed to do to conform with the law. And now every case needs to be renegotiated. And because the Clean Air Act has been one of the most effective and popular pieces of legislation passed during the past half century, I just wonder, why have the conservatives who dominate the court now been so engaged in this long-term strategy to limit this kind of federal activity?
Well, there's been a concerted, movement, conservative movement for decades, I guess, to dismantle and challenge regulatory agencies. It's really not a philosophical or dogmatic issue, but in my view, it's been applied so sporadically by courts and conservative foundations that it really is permitting business lobbyists, polluting utility companies and others, and the Koch brothers and others, to really have a disproportionate impact on the judicial system at this point. So leaving aside who's in the White House or who's in control of Congress, if in fact we've given the judiciary, deservedly so, I think, in past decades, a wide latitude and deference as being kind of above the fray deciding constitutional and legal issues. The judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, by wading into fundamental issues relating to the regulatory efforts to curtail climate change and air and water pollution, is really degraded itself. And we really have to start looking again to why we are deferring so completely to the Supreme Court on really political and policy issues.
So how is the EPA going to have to change how it operates in response to this ruling? You mentioned that they're going to have to address particular regulations on a case-by-case basis, but can they even hope to be effective in the face of all of the well-funded anti-regulatory opposition you just described?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, but on this issue, I have to be somewhat pessimistic, because what will happen and what has happened when the EPA has taken a case-by-case approach to regulation is that they've become bogged down in litigation in federal court over those regulations, and they start spending necessarily so much of their energy on legal defense and legal costs in court that they cannot really effectively expand or even apply even a limited regulatory scheme. I think they're going to try and do that, and hopefully the federal courts will decide challenges very quickly rather than tying up the regulatory efforts, but it's going to be on a sporadic basis. And some courts will be quickly responding to challenges and making decisions. Others will, unfortunately, I think, permit the issue to become bogged down in a legal morass. So it's going to be a real fight,
and one with an opponent that is incredibly well funded. You mentioned the Kochs, for instance. We could just see this stuff tied up for years before anything can happen. It seems like the absolute opposite of the efficiency that the conservative majority talks about wanting government to exercise on a regular basis. If this approach to regulation is applied in other areas such as securities, regulation, worker safety, what would the shape of the federal government look like as we try to move forward? And in particular, would the Securities and Exchange Commission be able to enforce its recent decision to require carbon risk and impact disclosures from public companies?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. It's an important issue. We don't know what the ultimate impact of West Virginia will be, but we know that, at least for now, the major questions doctrine is here to stay, and your prophecy will become true, I'm sure, as there will be challenges to SEC and other efforts by other agencies to control or at least have full transparency on climate change issues. I think that we'll have some favorable lower court decisions, but ultimately, the head of the snake is up at the Supreme Court, and the Biden administration has taken, in my view, too cautious a view. I think we're facing a constitutional and judicial crisis, at least of the quantum faced by the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s, where the New Deal, Works Progress administration, and other efforts to bring the U.S. economy back out of its stupor was met with negative decisions by the Supreme Court. They called it Supreme Court packing, and ultimately Supreme Court came to its senses without President Roosevelt having to make good on his threat to expand the court. but there's no constitutional number of judicial judges. It's expanded over time. We're now in a much more complex age.
Yep.
And quite frankly, leaving aside this issue, I don't think the number of justices, and given the small, minuscule number of cases that they take on, is really adequate to meet the current demands of the 21st century America. So I don't know why there's such a reluctance, but I think we need an expanded court, really one way or the other.
This is both a very useful conversation and disappointing to hear, but I need to take a brief commercial break. We're going to be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing the conversation about the Supreme Court's ruling in West Virginia versus EPA with attorney Kenneth Foard McCallion. So Ken, as I listen to what you're saying, and I reflect on the exhortations from the right that we should trust the market to work out the right way forward, I'm struck by the fact that that market is heavily tipped in favor of the people with the money, like the Koch brothers, the Scaife family, the Mellon family, and others, that are going to just simply stop a lot of progress. And I want to go back to the question of how did this happen? And you mentioned the 1970s earlier and the move with the launch of the Heritage Foundation to go in this direction. Has Mitch McConnell's manipulation of the Senate approval process for Supreme Court nominees tipped the court into a potentially permanent and terminal conservative majority? Is there any, other than adding justices, is there anything we can do?
Well, I don't know if it's terminal or not, but it seems to be embedded, the current disparity between conservative and more open-minded, I would say progressive justice. The disparity is so great now that it will impact certainly our generation, our children's generation, if not our grandchildren's generation. Obviously, there's some vagaries depending on life expectancies and so forth. We have a relatively young conservative court at this point. I think even Mitch McConnell will admit with a snicker, that there was a manipulation. It was a power grab. Nobody thought few people thought he'd be successful. And then the 2016 election came along and his scheme worked. The doomsday scenario played itself out. Is there anything we can do? Will the market work its way out? The problem is that, over the last several decades, at least in my view, and maybe this is going a bit far afield, but the market is looking for short-term returns. Well, the longer-term investment in future technologies, let's say clean air, clean water technologies, temperature change, climate change technologies, private industry relied heavily on government investment for that. So it was the taxpayers who were paying for the technology innovations in even battery technology, solar and other things. And then the license were let to private industry. That's kind of the scheme we've been working in post World War II. I could argue against it philosophically, but it worked reasonably well for a long time. But now you have long-term investments by the government in climate change, battery, alternative energy scenarios being basically gifted to private industry. And often private industry will use it as window dressing. The oil companies in particular using clean air technologies as really an advertising point rather than anything that's core to their particular industry. In any event, how do we change that in the market? as a lawyer, I focus on, the judicial system, but I think that there have been some positive movements in clean air, green energy investment groups and ethical investment strategies. It's still a minority position in most of the investment community. But my view is that America reacts really to crises. We slept through a good part of the 1930s as totalitarianism was on the rise. Then there was Pearl Harbor. Very often it takes a disaster like that to wake up a sleeping giant. And the problem is that a climate change crisis is much like putting a lobster in cold water and gradually increasing the temperature. The lobster really doesn't notice the change until it's too late. But I think that, with an increase in certainly hurricanes, extreme weather, pushing itself to the front pages, I think America is starting to get it. And hopefully we won't be too late in responding to the necessity for really all our legislative and investment decisions by the government to be geared. Our economic stimulus packages have to be climate change sensitive, just as there are other indices built into it. In the short term, unfortunately, Joe Manchin is standing in the way. Hopefully the midterms might change that. Stalemate in Washington, but all we can do is keep trying our best, pushing as hard as we can in as many different directions as we can until the sleeping giant of America wakes up and responds to the climate crisis.
That really gets me thinking about how we relate to the court. For conservatives, the Warren Court is the boogeyman, and they point to it. But now they have their equivalent of the Warren Court. However, it's a court led by somebody who is clearly not leading. Chief Justice Roberts doesn't control the conservative majority the way that Earl Warren worked so closely, actually more in the middle. He was an Eisenhower appointee, after all, with the more liberal justices to forge an incredible record of progressive decisions. Do you see Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the EPA opinion, as a tempering force or as a failed Chief Justice?
I would say we were cautiously optimistic up until the recent spate of decisions, including West Virginia. Roberts, particularly challenges to COVID-19 regulations, was surprisingly, sensible. However, much as the Republican Party is really, the tail is wagging the dog now, and the extremists in the party are really determining the party's future. Unfortunately, as you suggest, we see that in the Supreme Court, where the most conservative ideological justices now really leading the conservative majority without John Roberts' tempering and more moderate position holding sway. Hopefully the ship can be righted in the future, but it's not a good omen at all.
What would you recommend? I mean, if you had the opportunity to sit down with Roberts, what would you recommend he do to preserve the integrity of the court?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think that that Roberts, and he's tried this to some extent, if you follow inside baseball or inside the Supreme Court through his clerks and others and meetings that he's had. Obviously, they're confidential, but you get a sense that he has tried and temporarily failed really to take the bull by the horns with the conservative justices, particularly the most recently appointed ones feel that they have to be responsive to their constituents, Federalist Society and others, to show their bona fide conservative credentials. However, I think that Roberts could reach out, I think, more vigorously to the minority justices, more progressive justices. And he doesn't quite have the votes now to forge a majority, but I think if one or two of the conservative justices, at least on some of the issues, are able to move towards the middle, that a tenuous but hopefully effective, a moderate consensus can be reached on additional issues, important issues that are before the Supreme Court and will be coming there.
I think that you're hitting the nail on the head. We need a way forward to a new American consensus. But when I look at Congress, which is where a lot of these battles now have to be fought based on the decision, I don't see something that's constituted in a way that will respond to actual public opinion rather than special interests. Is there anything we can do to change the trajectory of congressional debate and priorities other than electing new representatives?
Well, I was going to say elect new representatives. However, I think in more direct answer to your question, representatives do reflect, while they are obviously leveraged by special interests, they are following to a large extent their constituents. And I think that the recent decisions on Roe v. Wade and others have shocked, some of those more towards the center of the political spectrum in such a way that in many of the swing districts, Republicans, particularly moderate Republicans, are beginning to sweat. Not only do they have to stave off challenges from the crazy right, not to be biased or anything, but also have to wonder, and the polls show that some of the more moderate voters who have voted Republican in suburban and other districts may well move decidedly to the blue Democratic side. So I'm not an inside politics kind of person, but they do know how their voters will vote. So we have to go to the American people.
Do you think that Congress could muster the will to pass a law that overturned the impact of Citizens United, which freed a lot of dark money to flow into politics? Is that potentially one way out of this conundrum?
Well, it is. And if I could wave my magic wand, I'd say that should be a priority in Congress. Right now, there have been attempts to move in that direction. The Democrats and moderates don't have the votes on that right now, but I think it requires raising the issue really in the public consciousness, and then it becomes an important congressional issue at that point again. The wheel tends to turn over time. I'm thinking more of the long term.
Right.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure how much of the long term time we really have.
Well, particularly with regard to climate change, this is the decisive decade, and if the far right, can keep us in place for another decade, we are both really in bad trouble and going to be challenged to be a viable country because of the kinds of impacts that we were talking about before, as sea level rises in particular. That Pearl Harbor may come too late. We may not be able to win that war. Now, so what advice do you have for citizens who want to take action to support robust climate policy? And I in particular want to ask, should that activity be focused at the state and municipal level, where the far right is focusing its efforts right now?
No, absolutely. And while I work, on an international and national scale, my eyes have been opened recently in our community, let's say in Greenwich, Connecticut, and throughout Connecticut, and smaller suburban communities in New York as well. I've been meeting with smaller groups, community groups, municipal leaders in the towns, environmental groups, and ordinary citizens who are growing gardens and cleaning up waste on the beaches. And while I might have previously thought these are small bore issues and aren't going to change the trajectory of climate and global destruction, I think that these efforts we can do as opposed to just throwing up our hands. And it's not only environmental efforts on a local level, but our fellow citizens in our towns and villages and communities really see us taking action. And instead of just jawboning them, trying to persuade them to also join in environmental protection movement, they see very tangible actions taking place, cleaning up parks, etc., and join in with us. So that's how public opinions can be influenced. And I'm doing a lot more of that instead of just decrying the degradation of the global ecology.
Well, it creates the momentum around the idea that we are both in it together and that we need to take these actions to protect the environment. I think you're making a really important point there. Kenneth, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you. And this is the launch date for my book, Saving the World One Case at a Time, available on Amazon. I have to make at least a little pitch on it. I'm very proud of it, and a lot of the chapters deal with major environmental cases that I've worked on: Exxon, Valdez, Bhopal disaster, and the Shore nuclear power case, and other cases. So this is a great day for me in two respects: one, the launch of the book, and the opportunity to discuss these issues with you.
Well, I'm glad we could do it. And we will include a link to the book in the article that goes with the podcast, folks, so you can find it. And Kenneth worked on some critically important cases. You mentioned Valdez and Bhopal in the conversation. But these battles are being fought in courts and in communities. Thanks again, Ken.
Much appreciated, Mitch. Thanks.
We've been speaking with Kenneth Foard McCallion. He's an attorney and author. You heard of his new book, Saving the World One Case at a Time. His points about making those investments of our time and energy in building our community response to the climate crisis is critically important, because right now the Supreme Court has never felt further from the concerns of everyday Americans. And in fact, public opinion, confidence in the Supreme Court has declined to a historic low. We're currently at 25% positive opinion about the court, compared to somewhere in the mid 40s starting in 2000, after which time we have, I think, lost confidence in a lot of our government. That's the question, is how do we start to reconstruct the dialogue that results in laws that are actually effective and help us move forward, that allow us to invest in our future together and not simply leave everybody to fend for themselves on their own. That's a nice myth, but it has never actually been true. This country was grown by communities and became a community across lines that were often fractured, such as by the Civil War, but we do find these middles. And when we do, such as between the beginning of World War II and the beginning of the 1970s, when most of the country was pulling together very strongly, we can make great things happen. We need better government, not just less government. So let's find the basis for that dialogue and start the conversation. This is Earth 911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We're going to be back soon in the Meantime, I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast and all the other ones that we have so that your friends, family, your coworkers, people you meet on the street, the whole community that you live in can start to talk about more ideas so we create less waste. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.